See, Greece, they just made their payment by going into the emergency funds of the IMF, and it seems they might not have enough money to make additional payments. And we hear rumblings about bail-ins. We hear rumblings about Greece leaving the Eurozone. What is your take on the situation of Greece?
Well, the situation obviously is very, very fluid. I think there's a meeting later on this week on the subject. My overall view is that Greece basically is bust, and I think it's as simple as that. I'm surprised that Greece has actually paid out the money over the last couple of months that it has. I think if I'd been a member of the government, if I was Yanis, the finance minister, I think I would have declared a default at a very early stage, preserved what I could because their bills to pay and all the rest of it. And they're now choosing between their creditors and their employees, and that is not a good political outcome. I think that this is recognised generally by the other members of the Eurozone, the other finance ministers. And so I think it then becomes a question of how do they treat the bankruptcy. I don't see a Greek exit for the very simple reason that the euro is the only currency that is used in Greece. The idea that the drachma can be conjured up out of thin air and replace it, I think is a complete nonsense. It's unrealistic. So I think what's likely to happen is not a Greek exit as such, but a suspension of facilities from the ECB towards the Greek banks. Now, what that would do is it would effectively mean that the Greek banks, which are already bankrupt, I mean, their bad debts already declared at the end of 2014 exceeds their equity, ex-goodwill, by a substantial margin. So those banks are already bust. They're running on hot air. I think that those banks would be allowed to go under, and then it would be a question of limiting the collateral damage. Now, whether we call it a bail-in or whatever, I think that becomes a moot point. I suspect that the finance ministers in Europe think that after the Cyprus problem, they think they've got a better handle on how to deal, if you like, in the aftermath of a Greek bankruptcy. I would question that because there's too much room for unintended consequences. But having said that, I think there is also an overriding objective in this, and that is that the hardliners in the north, Germany, Holland, the Finns and so on, would want to be absolutely certain that Italy and Spain and Portugal are not tempted to follow the bankruptcy route. So I think that they perceived it in their political interest to make this as hard as possible on the Greeks. And I think that's basically where we are. I mean, I don't see any pleasure coming out of this at all, and I think it's going to be very, very unpleasant for anyone living in Greece. And the other thing that's interesting is that the Greeks apparently have been drawing down their bank accounts by buying motor cars. So here's another unintended consequence. Mercedes and BMW sales and VW sales have taken off in Greece. Anyways, we shouldn't laugh about it. But I think I think making a serious point that restrictions on cash and all the rest of it, this is the way people are getting around it. And so the ordinary person, I think, sees the collapse coming in Greece. And when your population sees the collapse coming, it's actually, as a politician, you're then in a very, very difficult position because you've lost your basic support as well.
Do you see Russia and the BRICS system, do you see them doing anything with Greece at this time?
Well, they're toying with it, obviously, and we all know that Russia is talking about putting a pipeline through Turkey and then through Greece. And the point is that any of these pipelines, as they go through a territory, that territory can make a small rake-off on the fuel going through. So that would be a good little earner as far as Greece is concerned. And I think also as far as Russia is concerned, if she can have not allies, but neutral parties on either side of the Bosphorus, then that mobilizes her Crimean ports very, very effectively. So I think that's her overall interest. On that basis, I think that Russia is unlikely to step up and be aggressive about this. I think she's just going to be, there in the background saying, well, if you feel lonely, come and talk, sort of thing. So I think that's where they are. I wouldn't expect any fireworks out of Russia. Just an observant country. I think they would look at this from their own strategic point of view, but I don't think they're going to force any issues.
Okay. There was an article, and I quoted you in it on one of my reports about China, the BRICS system, and how China has been basically buying a lot of gold. And you said something very interesting about China. They could have 30,000 tons of gold or so, and they could use that to bring down the economy of the United States. I mean, this is a two-part question, actually. We see the AIIB, we see China, we see the yuan renminbi. They want to get that as a reserve currency. That's the first question. Do you see the yuan renminbi moving into the reserve status? The second part of the question is, how much gold do you think China has, and do you think they actually do have that 30 tons, and what are they planning to do with that?
Right. Well, starting with the renminbi and its reserve status, if what we mean by reserve status is, if you like, challenging the dollar's reserve status, I think the answer is no. What the Chinese are particularly interested in is the renminbi for settlement, trade settlement purposes. That is the beginning and the end of their interest there. Now, you could argue that a currency which is a member of the SDR basket has some sort of reserve status. Now, there is no doubt that China has the ambition to be part of the SDR basket, but they have been blocked in their ambition there by America, and the result is that the whole of Asia, and we're talking about Asia led by a partnership between China and Russia, are moving away from Western financial markets for the purposes of their own commerce. So what we're seeing is the establishment of the Asia Infrastructure Bank. We're seeing a new BRICS bank, which is a rival to the IMF, being set up. And I suspect that in a year or two's time, there will be a rival SDR issued by the new BRICS bank sometime after that's up and running. Now, in those circumstances, I think what we're likely to see is probably it's going to be a bit of a mixture, because you've got minor currencies such as the ruble and the yuan, and maybe the rupee, and possibly gold. Now, it's going to be interesting, because I have no doubt that China wants to bring gold into it, simply because if the SDR, the new SDR, is going to be used for trade settlement purposes, which is basically China's interest, then she's going to want to be paid in something stable. So in a sense, I can see that gold, if you like, would be the glue that would hold this rival SDR together. And then all the members in Asia would be very, very happy to accept each other's currencies, because they would have to tie themselves to gold. One way or the other. Now, how tightly or loosely, obviously, is going to be a matter of debate. Now, this has very important ramifications for the paper SDR, which obviously, against this, could turn out to be a very, very bad deal. And I think that we've got to look at it, if you like, in that sort of big, broad, strategic sense, rather than, China's got 30,000 tons of gold and so on and so forth. But turning to China's gold position, obviously she has not declared how much gold she has got. I think it is common knowledge that she's got considerably more gold than she admits are in her reserves, and I think she's declared something like 1,054 tons. The history of this will give you an idea of the scale, potentially, of the amount of gold that she has acquired. In 1983, China set forth the regulations for the acquisition of gold and silver. And this was to be a channel through the People's Bank, which is the central bank of China. It was going to be their responsibility to do this. Between 1983 and 2002, there were some very, very big capital inflows going into China, which had to be neutralized. And gold undoubtedly was part of this. At the same time, between those years, in the West, there was a major bear market in gold. The only buyers of the existing stocks plus newly mined gold were effectively the Middle East and not India, believe it or not, because India only really came in, well, she came in, I think, after 1992, after the Gold Control Act was repealed. But the other major buyer, which nobody actually really understood, has been China, because she has had the need to neutralize those capital flows without acquiring nothing but dollars. And if you just look at the numbers, the flows that go through, you come up with a figure which is quite possible that over that period of time she acquired about 20 to 25,000 tons. It's speculation on my part, that figure. I think that must be absolutely clear. But I think there are reasonable grounds for believing that that sort of figure is what they will have acquired. After 2002, they then freed up legally the rights of individuals in China to buy gold. Now, the Shanghai Gold Exchange was set up in 2002. Now, that tells me that at that stage, the Chinese government felt that they had got enough gold for their purposes, whatever those purposes might be. Now, since then, they have continued to invest very, very heavily in their own mine production, and they are now by far the world's largest miners of gold. They produce something like 430 tons a year now. The other thing which is worth bearing in mind is that the government has a monopoly over all the gold refining facilities in China. And not only does she take in her own gold, she also takes in gold from other countries, such as Mongolia. And her expansion into Africa has given her concentrate and doré for both gold and silver from sub-Saharan Africa in quite large quantities. So we're now talking about China is now the epicenter, if you like, for physical gold. To my mind, I can see that there is, if you like, a natural progression in her, the way she has pursued this. I think, firstly, when it started off, she was neutralizing capital flows. She was investing some of her reserves, undeclared, admittedly, in gold. It then went on, I think, to strategic purposes, because in 2002, the first charter, as well as the Shanghai Gold Exchange being set up, the first charter for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization came into existence. And this basically is a deal between China and Russia with the various countries in between. Under that deal, they cooperated in terms of security, cross-border investment, trade, and so on and so forth. And the one last thing that the SCO wanted to do, which brings us back to currencies, is to have a trade settlement system which was independent of the West. So you can see that, the whole thing has been planned for a very, very long time. The objectives may have shifted a bit, but the basic plan has been still in place. And I hope that gives you an overview of China's overall approach. There is one thing I would say, that she could use her dominance in the gold position to destroy the West. I don't think she's going to do that for two reasons. Firstly, if you have a nuclear bomb, you don't use it. It's the final option. And, if you use your final option, you haven't got a final option anymore. And secondly, it's not China's style. China doesn't go around like a bull in a china shop. Sort of rather like, dare I say it, America. America is a bit like the bull in the china shop. China is not. Her approach to life is simple. She'll turn up on the doorstep and say, "You want to trade?" And it's a simple question. And if you do, you're going to get some good deals. And if you don't, you say, "No, not today, thank you." We Europeans, we turn up and we say, "We want to trade with you, but before we do, We just want to lay down some ground rules. And in those ground rules, this is the way you're going to manufacture things. This is the way you're going to do that. Now, do you want to do business? And we get surprised when we're told to piss off. So that's the Chinese approach is very, very different from the Western approach. And I do not see them ever using their dominance in the gold market for the destruction of the West. If the West is destroyed, it will be the West destroying itself, and China will be protecting itself. And I think we've got to understand that emphasis.
Let me ask you, from your research, since China has created the Shanghai Gold Exchange, how will this affect the price of gold right now? Because they're basically dealing in the physical, not the paper.
Yes. Well, the great thing about derivatives is you can just expand the quantity of derivatives in order to suppress the price. And that, by and large, is what's been happening. This has given the Chinese the opportunity, and not just the government, but more publicly, the Chinese population, the opportunity to buy lots and lots of cheap gold. It's also given the opportunity to India to do exactly the same thing. And in fact, if you go all around Asia, you find that the Asians trust gold a lot more than their national currencies. Now, this is very much at odds with the West, because ever since, I suppose, really, the post-war years, gold has been denied to us as people. So we haven't had it, if you like, as a currency. And ever since Nixon drove us off, sort of ended Bretton Woods back in 1971, there has been a campaign to discourage us from thinking that gold could ever replace the dollar in particular, or any other major paper currency. Now, the result of this, and also incidentally, legislation in the last 30 years about the control of investments and promotion of investments, physical gold has been excluded as an investment. It is not regarded as an investment by the regulators, and therefore is not regarded as an investment by the banks, the fund managers, and so on and so forth. A gold mine, yes. A gold derivative, yes, but not physical gold. So what we've done is we've taken on, if you like, an approach to investment which has been driven by what we think is progress, but actually is regulation more than anything else, whereby we chase trends. And if you're a trend chaser, you buy gold because it is going up, and you sell it because it is going down. Now, this is a fundamentally different approach from that of the Asian gold hoarders, the people who use gold as money in Asia. They're only interested in one thing, and that is, if the price goes down, it's cheap, I'll go and buy some. So you can see that this has set the scene for gold to flow in enormous quantities from the west to the east.
Now let's move on to your article. You wrote Trouble with Cash, and we're starting to see a lot of economists from Citibank, J.P. Morgan Chase, and it seems like there's a push to get rid of cash. Now, why is this? Why are they trying to remove cash from society right now?
I think the real reason for this is not that it's can be used for tax avoidance and terrorism and all that stuff. The real reason is that the one chink in the central bank's armor when it comes to controlling the banking system in the event of crisis is the potential for a run on the banks. And by a run on the banks, what I mean is that you and I go to our bank and we actually physically take cash out of the bank as a means of reducing our exposure to that bank. If you don't have cash, then if we don't like our bank, then what we have to do is we have to transfer our money from that bank to another bank. And then that money gets recycled through the system. And if the bank we don't like, is in serious risk of insolvency, then what can happen is that the central bank will come along and ensure that they control the process. But in order for the central bank to do that, they have to ban cash. And I think that to an extent, the reason why they're doing this at the moment is that they are probably rather nervous about the way things are getting out of their control. I'm not saying that there is any sort of marker out there that says that there's something that's really scared them, but I think just as a general background, they feel that this is the way it should go.
Okay. So you don't see, I mean, every time something like this comes up where all of a sudden there's a push to do something, to me, personally, it seems like it's a red flag saying, yes, they're nervous about this and they believe that this could happen the way the entire global economy is right now. I mean, we look around, we see there's debt everywhere. We see what's happening to Greece. We saw what happened to Cyprus.
Yeah.
And, right now the world debt is, $200 trillion plus right now. And it's continually going up. We know it's not going to come down. And to me, that's kind of a red flag to me.
Well, I mean, you've gone through a story which is absolutely littered with red flags. The problem is that none of us know which red flag is actually going to bring the whole house down. Any of them could at any moment. That's the problem. And what I'm trying to say is that I think the central bankers are sitting there getting more and more nervous. QE isn't working. Governments haven't started. They have done nothing to reduce, their outstanding obligations, and so on and so on. And they're sitting there thinking, we've run out of ammunition. What the hell do we do now? And so I think that it would make sense, if you have that view, to try and control the fallout. And the fallout could be that a major bank comes under some sort of difficulty. Let us say, and I think we'll come on to this subject, I hope we come on to this subject a little later, but let us say that there is a sharp fall in the bond markets and it undermines a bank's balance sheet. Under those circumstances, you can see that the central banks would definitely want to control or stop our free right to have a run on the bank, to take our money out of the bank.
Yes, I agree with that. I do. Now, let's just stay on this topic for a second. If there is something that does occur, you wrote another article about there's not going to be deflation. Are we going to see deflation or are we going to see inflation right now? I mean, I see certain things going up in price, food especially, and other things that are not going up as much. And it's a little confusing to everyone of what's really going on at this point. What do you see happening?
Well, I think the first thing is that the government statistics in the form of the Consumer Price Index does not actually capture the current inflation scene. I don't live in America, so I don't experience it. But I came across something very interesting the other day, and I don't know if your listeners are aware of this. The Chapwood Index, that's CHAPWOOD Index. Now, this has been set up by a company who use social media to gather prices. And they gather prices on 500 items, commonly used items, both goods and services, from 50 major urban centers around America. So you can see that this is statistically significant. But what's interesting is that since they've been doing this in the years 2011 to 2014, over 4 years, they calculate the right rate of inflation. If you just take the arithmetic average of the rate of inflation in each of those 50 centers, it works out this. You've got inflation, price inflation, running about 10% per annum. So, I have to ask, how do you get 0.8 inflation on the CPI last year? So the first part of my answer to your question is that we're being, we're being misled into the idea that actually we have deflation. We don't. In America, you have a serious inflation problem. And that inflation over the last 4 years has meant that prices have risen by something like a compound rate of about 44%. This is a very significant rate of inflation, and there is no sign of it slowing down. And on that basis, we then come to the question, are we facing deflation or inflation? Another way of answering the inflation-deflation debate is that the official CPI shows that it's gone, inflation has fallen to 0.8%. But what we forget is that the Fed has printed an awful lot of money over the last 5 or 6 years. And what we do not take into account is the enormous quantities of money that the Fed will print over the next 5 or 6 years. So we have a situation where deflation is almost impossible. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to give if you like, a sort of a historical parallel to this. In 1919, if you lived in Germany or Austria, you had had a fairly significant inflation at that stage. But because the economy was so screwed, I mean, the flower of your productive youth had been slain on the battlefield. All that equipment that you'd bought had been lost. You had reparations. In other words, the burdens on those two countries, Germany and Austria, were so great in the years immediately following the First World War, that the common thought in those countries was exactly what we have today. We faced deflation. And what happened? It then took off. In the case of Austria, it peaked in, I think, late 1922. And in the case of Germany, the inflation finally completely collapsed the currency in November 1923. So only 3 or 4 years after the common view amongst the populace was that, and indeed, amongst economists in those countries, was that there was, the real risk was deflation. The currency had collapsed entirely.
So you mentioned the Fed creating money, and we see Draghi is creating money in Europe. How long can they keep this up? I mean, we know Japan has done it. We see Europe is doing it. We understand the Fed is most likely still doing it. How long can they keep this up until they can't do it anymore? I mean, or can they just do it forever?
It's the only tool that they have got. That I think is something that needs to be said. They will do it as long as there is value in the currency, because they have got no escape. We're now in if you like, in a debt crisis, a debt trap from which there is no escape as far as governments are concerned, apart from printing money. So they will do it until they destroy the currencies. It really is as simple as that.
And how long? I mean, do you see a collapse coming? Do you see anywhere, some people are talking about this fall, and some people saying if it doesn't happen this fall, we might make it to next year?
Well, timing is always very difficult. Yeah. And if I knew what the price of anything was tomorrow, I wouldn't be telling you. I'd be trading on it. Let me answer it another way. I've just drawn your attention to the Chapwood Index, which has shown that inflation has been running at consistently around about 10% per annum over the last 4 years. Now, that being the case, if you look at the pricing of the Treasuries market, that is reflecting an inflation rate which is a lot closer to that shown by the Consumer Price Index, with presumably the prospects of deflation thrown in. So what I'm saying is that the bond markets are incredibly mispriced. If the bond markets were priced so that the true rate of inflation was actually reflected, then you would be looking at a 10-year bond, which would be priced at a 10% yield. It works out at about $52, $53 per 100 of face. So in other words, a complete halving. If you're going to have any margin over that 10%, which I would have thought is how it would turn out, firstly, because these things overshoot, and secondly, once the market wakes up to this, there is going to be, if you like, certainly a fall, let's call it a fall rather than a collapse, in the purchasing power of paper currencies. Then you're looking at, bond prices which are going to go to anything between a half and a third of where they are today as you go out along that yield curve. Now, the banks have loaded up with these bonds. They've loaded up because they don't like lending to ordinary people. It's, Wall Street is dealing for Wall Street, not Main Street. So the consequence of this is that the banks all go bust. And how you get out of that, I don't know. It's just a question of when it is that people begin to realize that actually we do have inflation. It is around about 10%. And there may well be a risk with all the money printing that is going on around the world that rate of inflation could actually increase. So as soon as this begins to, if you like, filter into people's psyche, and I think it's probably sooner rather than later, I think it is a bond market collapse which will take down the financial system.
So what can people expect? I mean, if the system does come down, in your opinion, what will people actually see, feel? Will it be like 2008?
Well, this is interesting. I think it's going to be a bit different from 2008. I mean, 2008 we had a specific problem. Mm-hmm. We had Lehman and we had AIG and we had Bear Stearns, a few others. And we looked at, the derivatives market collapsing. We looked at, absolute horrors. And suddenly the whole system is going to fall apart. The Fed basically gave unlimited guarantees and, we breathed a sigh of relief and life continued. This time round, I don't know that it's going to be so easy because how does the Fed control a market which is priced 100% above where it should be? It can't happen forever. Right. So let's think on the ramifications. As soon as it's understood in the bond markets that they are wildly mispriced, then that obviously affects equity markets. So, your stocks are going to come under huge, huge pressure. It also affects things like mortgage rates. So that's going to undermine the value of residential property. And, you could go on and on. Now, the problem then is that, you're sitting here having basically had your savings wiped out or on the way to being wiped out, because you're probably fully invested on the basis that the Fed is going to look after you. And you start thinking about, and my cash balances in the banks. I can't draw those out now because I can't, I'm not allowed to take out cash. So what do? I think the Greeks are leading the way. We go and buy Mercedes cars or whatever. I mean, so in other words, what you're going to get is a flight not only out of the banks, but you could very rapidly get a flight out of cash as well because you can't hold cash. So one of the unintended consequences of this, and this is a real horror scene, is that the currencies collapse with it.
Wow. And that would just open up a whole new can of worms of basically what happens here in Europe and UK, where the currencies are worth absolutely nothing. And I guess purchasing food, supplies, and things like that would become very, very difficult at that point in time.
Well, that's right. I mean, I remember I was in New York, I think it was back in about 2011, speaking at a function, and one of the other speakers was a professor of economics at is it George Mason University? Mm-hmm. And I was having this discussion with him. He foresaw this at that time. I was also foreseeing it. I mean, I have to say that this is something that's been in the works for a very long time. We just never know when. We don't know how long they can spin it out, kick the can down the road, whatever. What he was trying to do was he was trying to persuade the state where he lived that they ought to actually distribute, if you like, in credit card form, gold and silver balances to the electorate so that they would have something to spend once the dollar was completely destroyed. Now, I mean, if you think about it, let's assume that currency goes. I go down the road to buy a loaf of bread. So I go into the baker. Now, I haven't got anything to give the baker. Now, I might be able to sell him a service. I might be able to say, well, look, I'm a hotshot economist and I can, tell you a bit about what's likely to happen. I doubt he'll buy it, but if he does, he's then got a problem. How is he going to get the flour? It's made in a mill 100 miles away. Who's going to pay for the transport and all the rest of it? We need money for our modern society. We cannot exist without it. There is no such thing as barter. So this potential destruction, and believe me, I do not want to see this to happen. Mm-hmm. I'm not forecasting it. I think it's becoming an increasing possibility. This is a horror story, and it's a horror story for our family, our friends, and the elderly, and all the rest of it. And so we don't want this to happen at all. And I can't put a probability on it, but it's something that I think we should bear in mind. And maybe if one has any sort of sense of the risks that we face, that you take some sort of action. And that's really why I'm such a proponent of sound money. And the only sound money there is in the world is what the Chinese have basically cleaned us out of, and that's gold and silver.
Right. Thank you very much for coming on the X22 Report Spotlight. I'm very happy that you're on here. Thank you very much.
Dave, that was my pleasure. Thank you.